You can replace this text with any text you wish. You can either write in this text box or paste your own text here. Try different languages and voices. Change the speed and the pitch of the voice. You can even tweak the SSML, speech synthesis markup language, to control how the different sections of the text sound. Click on SSML above to give it a try. Enjoy using text-to-speech. It all began on an ordinary Thursday morning in late spring. The kind of morning where the sun glows just right, the coffee tastes perfect, and the world seems calm, until the HOA letter arrives. 4 years, the neighborhood had been a picture-perfect slice of suburban life. Perfect lawns, identical mailboxes, driveways that lined up like soldiers. A place where conformity was not just encouraged, it was enforced. The homeowner, a man named Mark, had lived in the community for nearly 8 years. He was quiet, responsible, and by most standards, the ideal neighbor. He paid his dues, maintained his yard, and minded his own business. But the HOA had a way of finding problems where there were none. That morning, a white envelope appeared on his front porch, taped to the door. The HOA's logo sat smugly at the top, printed in bold blue ink. Inside, it claimed he had violated Section 14B, driveway usage and aesthetic standards. The reason? Parking his own vehicle in his own driveway overnight. Mark was stunned. It wasn't like he had parked on the street or blocked anyone's way. His car, a perfectly ordinary sedan, sat neatly in the middle of his own property. The letter cited that driveways were intended for temporary vehicle movement only, and that all residential parking must occur within enclosed garages. It was absurd, even laughable. But what made it worse was the fine. $200 for a first offense. The frustration hit him harder than he expected. It wasn't about the money. It was about the principle, the idea that someone else could dictate how he used his own property. Over the next few days, the HOA board continued its silent campaign. More letters followed. Each one was colder, more robotic, and increasingly aggressive. They accused him of repeated violations, even though he had done nothing beyond parking where he always had. Soon, the fines began to stack up. $200 became $400, then $800. The HOA's tone changed from warning to legal action pending. Mark realized this wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was personal. He had seen it happen before. The HOA board, led by a woman named Denise, the self-appointed protector of neighborhood standards, had a reputation for targeting anyone who didn't fall perfectly in line. Denise was the kind of person who treated the HOA handbook like scripture. She lived for rules and took pride in enforcing them. She once fined another resident for leaving a trash bin out too early the night before pickup. Another neighbor had been cited for planting flowers that were not within the approved color palette. It wasn't about keeping the community beautiful, it was about control. Mark tried reasoning at first. He sent polite emails, pointing out that there was no mention of overnight parking in the HOA's official bylaws. He even attended a board meeting, only to be interrupted and dismissed mid-sentence. Denise had smirked, reading out the interpretation clause that allowed the HOA to define acceptable usage as deemed appropriate. That's when he realized reasoning wouldn't work. They didn't want compliance, they wanted obedience. And if there was one thing Mark hated, it was being bullied in his own home. Weeks passed, and the harassment continued. Anonymous notes appeared on his windshield. One morning, his trash cans were mysteriously knocked over. Another time, someone left a printed copy of the HOA's parking policy, taped to his front window. It was clear they wanted him to give in, to park inside his garage like everyone else, no matter how inconvenient. But Mark wasn't the type to surrender quietly. He began researching his options. He dove deep into property law, zoning codes, and municipal ordinances. Night after night, he pored over documents that most people would never think to read. He learned about the difference between private property and common interest developments. He discovered loopholes buried in legal jargon, phrases that defined how property could be used, leased, or operated. And that's when the idea hit him. If the HOA claimed he couldn't park in his driveway because it wasn't for residential vehicle use, what if it wasn't residential anymore? What if his driveway became something else entirely? something outside the HOA's control. Mark's mind raced. He realized his property was located on the edge of the community, bordering a small public road. According to the city's zoning map, that particular strip of land could technically qualify for limited commercial activity if registered properly. It was a small loophole, almost invisible, but perfectly legal. Over the next few weeks, he quietly set his plan into motion. He filed a simple application with the city, classifying his driveway as a private parking rental space. It wasn't a full business, just a registration that allowed him to lease or rent his own parking area. The paperwork took time, but once it cleared, the transformation was official. His driveway was no longer just a residential feature. It was now a licensed commercial property, and under city law, the HOA had zero authority over commercial zones. The next time a letter arrived demanding payment, Mark didn't even bother to open it. He simply took a photo of his new registration certificate, framed it, and hung it proudly in his garage. Then he listed his driveway online as a private commuter parking spot, close to downtown. Within days, he had his first renter, a local contractor who needed somewhere to park his work van during the week. The HOA had no idea what was coming. To them, Mark was just another stubborn resident refusing to obey. But behind the scenes, the rules were about to turn against them, in the most spectacular way possible. Because soon, the quiet suburban street would start looking a little different. More cars, more movement, more activity. And when the HOA tried to stop him again, they would learn the hard way that sometimes, the best revenge isn't breaking the rules. It's mastering them. Tob continued. When the first car appeared in Mark's driveway, a white contractor van with magnetic business logos on the doors. It was as if a silent alarm went off in the neighborhood. Curtains twitched. Dogs barked. The steady, suburban calm of the street cracked just slightly. By mid-morning, word had already reached Denise and her loyal board members. They saw the van as a personal affront, a challenge to the order they had worked so hard to enforce. To them, the presence of a commercial vehicle on residential property was not just unsightly. It was blasphemy. Within 24 hours, another letter appeared on Mark's door. This one was thicker than before, folded with bureaucratic precision. The HOA demanded the immediate removal of the vehicle, citing unauthorized business activity within a residential zone. Mark smiled when he read it. He had been waiting for this moment. The HOA had just accused him of doing something they legally couldn't regulate. He scanned the letter into his computer, attached his new zoning certification, and sent it back with a simple note. Please direct any further complaints to the city zoning office. It was the first time in years anyone had dared to push back like that, and the HOA didn't know how to handle it in the days that followed. More vehicles began to appear in Mark's driveway. A silver sedan on Monday, a plumber's truck on Wednesday, and even a small delivery van on Friday afternoons. Mark had quietly expanded his operation, listing the space online as a secure daytime parking option for tradespeople and commuters who needed affordable access to the nearby downtown area. Every booking came with a signed short-term rental agreement, perfectly legal and meticulously documented. The money started to add up faster than he expected. What began as a spiteful reaction turned into a surprisingly lucrative side business. Each month, the HOA fines he had ignored were more than covered by his new income stream. But the money wasn't the best part. It was watching the HOA unravel. At first, Denise assumed this was a fluke. She was convinced she could scare him into compliance. She ordered the HOA's legal team to send cease and desist notices. But when they contacted the city, they got an answer they hadn't expected. The city clerk confirmed that Mark's property had been partially rezoned under the mixed-use exception clause. The HOA's jurisdiction stopped where commercial zoning began. That single sentence shattered their control. In an emergency meeting, the HOA board gathered in Denise's living room. They debated, argued, and fumed. But no matter how many pages of bylaws they flipped through, the result was the same. The rules they loved to quote simply didn't apply anymore. Meanwhile, Mark continued to operate quietly, never gloating, never rubbing it in. He mowed his lawn, waved politely to passing neighbors, and carried on with his life. But word spread fast. A few curious residents began asking him how he did it. Some wanted to understand the loophole. Others just wanted to see the HOA squirm. It wasn't long before whispers turned into curiosity, and curiosity into imitation. Another homeowner, tired of constant HOA micromanagement, started renting out their garage for storage. Another offered their driveway as a weekend parking spot for nearby eventgoers. Within a month, the HOA was dealing with not one, but 3 commercially licensed properties inside their perfect little community. Denise was livid. She accused Mark of corrupting the neighborhood, insisting he was destroying the community's values. She even tried to rally residents against him, calling his actions a threat to property values. But the same neighbors she counted on for support were now questioning her authority. Some of them, long tired of her overreach, quietly sided with Mark. Soon, the tension boiled over. The HOA board began sending inspectors around the neighborhood to document violations. But every time they tried to approach Mark's property, he simply pointed to the sign he had posted near the edge of his driveway. Private commercial zone entry by HOA representatives prohibited. The sign was completely legitimate. It cited the municipal ordinance that granted him exclusive control over his commercial space. The HOA could fine, threaten, or complain all they wanted, but legally, they couldn't step foot on his property without his consent. Mark's small act of defiance had turned into a revolution. But the HOA wasn't ready to give up. A few weeks later, a letter arrived, not from the HOA this time, but from a law firm representing them. It was a formal complaint, demanding a hearing to determine whether his commercial activity violated the community's spirit of residential living. The letter was filled with legal threats, obscure citations, and exaggerated claims about traffic, noise, and degradation of visual harmony. Mark read it slowly, then set it down. He knew this wasn't about aesthetics or harmony. It was about control. The HOA couldn't stand that someone had beaten them at their own game, and now they were desperate to take that power back, so he decided to fight them head-on. He gathered every piece of evidence he had: zoning paperwork, correspondence with city officials, photos, emails, and the original letters from the HOA. He created a binder thicker than a phone book, filled with everything he would need to expose their tactics. When the day of the hearing arrived, the HOA board assembled at the community center. Denise sat at the head of the long table, surrounded by her fellow board members and their attorney. Mark walked in calmly, his binder in hand, and took a seat across from them. The air was tense, the silence sharp enough to cut. The HOA's attorney began with a speech about community cohesion and preserving neighborhood standards. They tried to paint Mark as a troublemaker, someone undermining the rules everyone agreed to follow. But when it was Mark's turn, he didn't speak with anger. Instead, he let the facts do the work. He laid out the zoning documents one by one. He cited the municipal code sections that stripped the HOA of authority over mixed-use properties. He presented the city's written confirmation of his exemption. And finally, he pulled out the HOA's own correspondence, highlighting every arbitrary fine, every empty threat, every abuse of power. By the time he finished, the attorney's confidence had evaporated. Even some of the board members looked uneasy. Denise sat silently, her jaw tight, her face pale. She knew she had lost. The ruling came 2 days later. The HOA's complaint was dismissed in its entirety. Not only was Mark's business legal, but the city also issued a formal warning to the HOA, reminding them of the limits of their authority. Any further interference could result in legal penalties against them. The victory was complete, but Mark wasn't done yet. He had proven his point, but now he saw an opportunity to make something bigger out of this. What had started as revenge had become a movement. Other residents began asking for help navigating their own property rights. Mark realized that by helping them, he could chip away at the HOA's control piece by piece. And soon, the same board that fined him for parking in his driveway would face an even bigger surprise, one that would turn the entire neighborhood upside down. Tob continued. In the weeks that followed the hearing, the neighborhood began to change in quiet but unmistakable ways. It started with whispers, small conversations over fences, in driveways, at mailboxes. Neighbors who had once kept their heads down and accepted the HOA's rulings began to ask questions. They wanted to know what Mark had done, how he had stood up to the board, and, most importantly, how he had won. The story spread faster than gossip ever had. Mark, the man who once received fines for parking in his own driveway, had defeated the HOA using nothing more than knowledge and persistence. To the other homeowners, he wasn't just a neighbor anymore. He was a symbol, a reminder that the rules only held power when people allowed them to. Soon, Mark's phone began ringing. At first, it was one or two residents asking for advice. Then it became dozens. People wanted help deciphering the HOA's bylaws, understanding property rights, and identifying loopholes of their own. What had started as a small act of defiance was quietly evolving into something far larger. Mark didn't set out to lead a rebellion. He just wanted peace in his own home. But when he saw how many others were suffering under the same petty tyranny, he realized that maybe this was something worth pushing further. He started a small online group for residents of the community, a place to share stories, advice, and resources. Within a week, half the neighborhood had joined. Within 2, even residents from neighboring communities were requesting access. The HOA board, of course, was furious. Denise saw the group as a direct challenge to her authority. In her mind, this wasn't just about parking anymore. It was about power slipping through her fingers. She sent out an official statement to all residents, warning that online organizing against HOA regulations may constitute harassment and defamation. But the warning only fueled the fire. Residents who had once been afraid now felt emboldened. They began comparing notes, uncovering inconsistencies in the HOA's finances and questionable spending habits by the board. Someone discovered that Denise had been reimbursing herself for administrative expenses that weren't properly documented. Another resident found that the HOA had been collecting fees for security patrols that never actually took place. Mark had lit a spark, and now the entire neighborhood was burning with curiosity and anger. Over the next month, he worked quietly with a few trusted neighbors to compile evidence. Every receipt, every unexplained expense, every shady vote recorded in meeting minutes was added to a growing file. When they were ready, they didn't go to the HOA. They went straight to the county auditor's office. The investigation that followed sent shockwaves through the community. The county found that several board members, including Denise, had misused HOA funds for personal gain. The report was made public, and within days, the board was forced to call an emergency election. Denise resigned before she could be formally removed. Her once loyal supporters turned on her instantly, desperate to distance themselves from the scandal. When the dust settled, the HOA was left in disarray. For the first time in years, the neighborhood was free from its suffocating grip. The fines stopped. The constant inspections ended. The rigid enforcement of meaningless rules vanished overnight. The new interim board, made up mostly of residents who had supported Mark, vowed to reform the HOA from the ground up. Transparency, fairness, and accountability became the new principles guiding their decisions. Mark watched it all unfold quietly from his front porch. He never wanted power or recognition, but he couldn't deny a small sense of pride in what had happened. What began as a fight over one driveway had become a full-scale transformation of the community. Meanwhile, his driveway business continued to thrive. Contractors, commuters, and delivery drivers still rented his parking space. The income had become a steady side stream, but more than that, it served as a constant reminder of how far he had come. Every car that pulled into that driveway was a small victory, a symbol of independence and the power of standing up to unfair authority. Months passed, and life in the neighborhood began to feel different. People were more relaxed, friendlier, even happier. Without the constant threat of fines or reprimands, they started taking pride in their homes for the right reasons, not to avoid punishment, but because they wanted to. Kids played in driveways again. Neighbors chatted on sidewalks without worrying about being cited for loitering. The neighborhood had finally become a community. And as for Denise, rumor had it she moved to another HOA development across town, a place even stricter than the one she had left behind. Some said she tried to join the new board there, but word of her reputation had already spread. No one wanted her in charge again. Mark didn't think about her much anymore. He had bigger things to focus on. His online group had grown into a small organization dedicated to helping homeowners understand their rights. He called it the Driveway Defense League, a tongue-in-cheek name that carried the perfect amount of irony. Through it, he shared resources, legal advice, and stories from people all over the country dealing with similar HOA abuses. Soon, local news outlets picked up his story. Headlines read, "Homeowner outsmarts HOA, turns driveway into thriving business, and suburban rebellion. How one man changed his neighborhood." The videos went viral online, sparking nationwide discussions about the power and limits of homeowners associations. Mark didn't care much for fame, but he appreciated the message spreading. It wasn't about breaking rules or defying order, it was about balance. HOAs could serve a purpose when managed fairly, but too often they became tools for control rather than community. His story proved that ordinary people could fight back and win. One crisp autumn evening, months after everything had settled, Mark stood at the edge of his driveway, watching as the last of the day's renters drove off. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the quiet street. The neighborhood was calm again, but this time, it was a calm built on freedom, not fear. He looked down at the clean concrete where it had all begun. The same driveway that once brought him stress, fines, and frustration now represented independence. What had started as petty revenge had grown into something meaningful. A reminder that sometimes, standing up for yourself can inspire others to do the same. Mark walked back inside, turning off the porch light as he went. The street behind him was peaceful, dotted with homes that finally felt like homes again. Not rule-bound properties in a controlled system, but individual spaces where people could live freely. The HOA had tried to fine him for parking in his own driveway. Instead, he had changed the entire neighborhood. And that, in the end, was the sweetest victory of all.